Someone in your life is manipulating you right now. Not in a dramatic way. Not with obvious lies or visible threats. Not with the crude, detectable manipulation of a bad actor in a film. In a way that is quiet, consistent, and almost completely invisible to the person it is being done to. In a way that has been operating in your closest relationships, your professional environment, and possibly your own home for longer than you realize. And the reason you have not detected it is not because you are not intelligent. The reason you have not detected it is because the most effective manipulation is specifically designed to feel like something else. Like love. Like concern. Like honest feedback. Like the natural dynamics of a relationship between people who care about each other. Machiavelli understood manipulation with a precision that most people find uncomfortable. He was not a man who celebrated it. He was a man who documented it. Who described the mechanics of how people use others as instruments for their own ends with the same clinical detachment that a physician describes disease, not because he approved of the disease. Because he believed that a person who understood the disease was far less likely to die from it. He wrote in The Prince that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived. This is not a cynical dismissal of human intelligence. It is a precise forensic observation about human psychology. The person being deceived is not stupid. They are trusting. They are hoping. They are extending to others the generosity of assuming good faith, and that generosity, Machiavelli argued, is the primary raw material that manipulation requires. This video will not make you paranoid. It will not teach you to distrust everyone. What it will do is give you 7 specific, observable, behavioral patterns that constitute the most common and most effective forms of manipulation that are operating in ordinary human relationships right now. Not in spy thrillers. Not in corporate boardrooms. In your immediate personal environment. Knowing the pattern does not mean assuming everyone around you is using it. It means you will recognize it when it appears, and recognizing it is the difference between a person who is managed and a person who is free. Way 1: Manufactured obligation. The first and most ancient form of manipulation operates through a simple psychological mechanism that the sociologist Robert Cialdini identified in his landmark 1984 study as reciprocity. The principle is straightforward. When someone does something for us, we feel an automatic, almost involuntary obligation to do something in return. This is not a weakness. It is one of the foundational mechanisms of human social cooperation. It is how communities function, how trust is built, how relationships develop over time. The manipulator does not create this mechanism. They exploit it. The pattern works like this. An unrequested favor is extended to you. Something you did not ask for, did not need, and perhaps did not particularly want. But it is framed as generosity, as care, as the natural behavior of someone who values you. And because the favor was unrequested and unsolicited, you have no framework for refusing it or returning it immediately. You simply receive it. And in receiving it, you accumulate a debt. The debt is then called in at a moment of maximum convenience for the person who created it. Not immediately. The timing is part of the strategy. The gap between the favor and the request allows the original debt to feel like it has been sitting in your account for some time, gathering a kind of moral interest. By the time the request arrives, saying no feels not just unhelpful but actively ungrateful. Like a betrayal of someone who has already invested in you. Machiavelli observed this mechanism in political contexts throughout The Prince. He described courtiers who cultivated relationships with princes through a long sequence of small generosities, none of which was particularly significant in isolation, but which together constructed a relationship in which the prince felt an accumulated obligation that could be called in at the moment of greatest strategic value to the courtier. The defense against manufactured obligation is not cynicism. It is precision. Before accepting an unrequested favor, ask yourself one question. If this person asked me for something significant tomorrow, would the existence of this favor make it harder for me to say no? If the answer is yes, you are looking at manufactured obligation. You are not required to accept every gift that is extended to you, particularly when the gift arrives without context and from someone whose motives you have not yet fully mapped. Way 2. Reframing your reality. There is a psychological process called gaslighting. The term has become so widely used that it has lost some of its precision, so I want to be exact about what it actually describes. Gaslighting is a systematic pattern of behavior in which one person causes another person to doubt the accuracy of their own perceptions, memories, and judgments. The name comes from a 1944 film in which a husband systematically manipulates his wife into believing she is losing her mind by secretly dimming the gas lights in their home and then denying that any change has occurred when she notices it. In ordinary relationships, it does not look like a film plot. It looks like this. You observe something. A tone of voice. A pattern of behavior. An inconsistency between what someone said and what they did. You raise it. You say, "That felt dismissive," or "I noticed that you said one thing and did another," and the response is not an engagement with what you observed. The response is a redirection to your observation. You are too sensitive. You are always looking for problems. You misremember things. That is not what happened. You always do this. The subject of the conversation shifts from what you observe to the reliability of your observation. And if this pattern repeats often enough, something genuinely damaging begins to happen. You start to preemptively doubt your own perceptions before raising them. You start to apply the other person's dismissal to your own thoughts before they are even spoken. You become, in a very real psychological sense, a person who no longer trusts their own reading of their own experience. Machiavelli's framework for this is his consistent insistence on the primacy of direct observation over received interpretation. He wrote that a man who relies on what others tell him about reality rather than what he observes directly has surrendered the most important strategic asset he possesses. He called it the inability to see things as they are. And he identified it as one of the primary vulnerabilities that manipulators exploit. The defense is simple and difficult in equal measure. Keep a private record of your own observations. Not to build a case. Not for any external purpose, simply as a practice of honoring your own perceptions as real data rather than as interpretations that require someone else's validation. When someone tells you that you did not see what you saw, your record is there. Not to argue from. To remind yourself. You saw what you saw. Way 3. Emotional flooding. In 1994, the psychologist John Gottman identified what he called flooding as one of the primary mechanisms through which conflict in close relationships becomes destructive. Flooding is the state of being overwhelmed by emotional intensity to the degree that rational processing becomes temporarily unavailable. When a person is flooded, their capacity for calm assessment, for holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, for making decisions that align with their actual values, is significantly compromised. The manipulator does not need to understand Gottman's research to use this mechanism. They have discovered through experience that a person in an emotionally overwhelmed state is a person who will agree to things they would not agree to when calm, who will make commitments under pressure that they would never make from a position of equanimity, who will say things designed to end the emotional intensity rather than things that accurately represent their actual position. The pattern looks like this. A request is made. You hesitate, or decline, or indicate that you need to think about it. The response is an escalation of emotional intensity. Not necessarily anger, though anger is one version of it. It could be tears, extreme distress, a performance of profound hurt, a declaration that your hesitation means something terrible about you as a person or about the relationship itself. The emotional temperature rises rapidly, and it does not drop until you provide the agreement that was originally requested. This is not always conscious. Many people who use emotional flooding as a manipulation tool do not experience themselves as manipulating. They experience themselves as genuinely feeling the emotions they are performing, or as genuinely hurt by the other person's hesitation. This does not change its function. The function is to create an emotional environment in which your natural desire to reduce the distress of someone you care about overrides your capacity to make decisions from your own values. Machiavelli wrote about the prince who makes decisions in the heat of passion and then must live with the consequences in the cold light of reason. He argued that the prince who cannot delay a decision until the emotional temperature has dropped is a prince whose decisions are being made by whoever controls the emotional temperature of the room. The defense is the capacity to name flooding when you recognize it and to delay decisions until it passes. I can see that you are upset. I am not going to make a decision right now. We can return to this when both of us are calmer. This sentence will be resisted by the person who is using emotional flooding as a tool. That resistance is itself information. Way 4. Strategic victimhood. One of the most sophisticated and least recognized forms of manipulation is the strategic use of victimhood as a tool of power. It is sophisticated precisely because it inverts the normal power dynamic in a way that makes resistance feel like cruelty. The person presenting themselves as the victim appears to be the person with less power. In reality, in this specific dynamic, they are the person with more of it. The pattern works by establishing a framework in which any assertion of your own needs, boundaries, or interests is automatically recast as an act of aggression against someone who is already suffering. You cannot say no to the request because the person making the request is framed as already vulnerable. You cannot raise your own concerns because raising them in the context of the other person's greater suffering makes them seem trivial or selfish. You cannot exit a situation that is not working for you because your exit would cause damage to someone who is already damaged. This creates what psychologists call a double bind. A situation in which every available option leads to a negative outcome for the person being manipulated. If you comply, your own needs go unmet and the dynamic continues. If you assert yourself, you become the aggressor in a narrative you did not write and cannot easily contest. Machiavelli observed this pattern in political terms. He described advisors who maintained their position by making themselves appear indispensable through their apparent fragility, who created situations in which the prince could not remove them without appearing monstrous, who had, in effect, made their weakness into a fortress. The defense requires a distinction that is genuinely difficult to make in the presence of real human suffering, but which is essential. The distinction between suffering that is real and suffering that is deployed. Real suffering exists. Real vulnerability requires genuine compassion and response. But compassion is not the same as compliance. A person's genuine pain does not create an obligation for you to override your own judgment about what is right and what is not. You can hold both things simultaneously. Their pain is real. And this is still not something I am going to do. Way 5. Isolation as architecture. The fifth way is structural rather than behavioral. It does not operate through a single incident or a specific conversation. It operates over time, through a gradual reconfiguration of your social environment that leaves you increasingly dependent on the person who is orchestrating the reconfiguration. The pattern is consistent. The relationships and environments that exist independent of the manipulator begin to be characterized as problematic. Your friends are described as a bad influence, or as people who do not really understand you, or as people who are holding you back. Your family relationships are reframed as toxic or as sources of the psychological difficulties that only the manipulator can help you address. Your professional connections are subtly discouraged. Your independent interests and activities are framed as things that take you away from what really matters. None of this happens suddenly. Each individual step is small enough to seem reasonable in isolation. One concern about one friend, one observation about one family member, one question about one professional relationship. But the cumulative effect, over months or years, is that the rich network of independent relationships that constituted your social world has been quietly replaced by a single point of contact. And that single point of contact is the person who engineered the replacement. Machiavelli wrote about the prince who allows himself to be surrounded exclusively by the counsel of one advisor as a prince who has given that advisor absolute power while maintaining only the appearance of holding it himself. He argued that a prince's greatest protection against manipulation was the breadth of his counsel. The man who draws from many sources cannot be controlled by any of them. The defense against isolation as architecture is to actively maintain the breadth of your independent relationships even when it is inconvenient, even when it is questioned, even when you are given reasons why a specific relationship is not worth maintaining. The person who benefits from your isolation will always provide reasons for it. Your job is to notice the consistent direction of those reasons. Way 6. The moving goalpost. There is a particular form of manipulation that targets the specific psychology of people who are motivated by achievement and by the desire to meet the expectations of those they care about. It works by creating a standard of performance or behavior, allowing you to meet that standard, and then immediately replacing it with a new and higher standard, so that the state of approval or acceptance you are working toward is never actually reached. The mechanics are straightforward. You are told that a certain thing is needed. You provide it. Instead of the relationship arriving at a state of equilibrium, the provision of what was needed is either minimally acknowledged or completely ignored, and a new and different need is immediately identified. You change. The standard changes. You meet the new standard. The standard changes again. This creates a specific psychological state in the person it is done to. A state of chronic inadequacy combined with chronic effort. You are always working, always trying, always investing, and the investment never produces the outcome you are investing toward. The approval, the peace, the stable acceptance that the standard implied as its reward is permanently located just beyond the current horizon. What makes this particularly effective as manipulation is that it is almost impossible to name without appearing unreasonable. If you say that the standard keeps changing, the response is that you are making excuses for not meeting it. If you say that your effort is not being recognized, the response is that recognition must be earned. The framework of the dynamic makes any complaint about the dynamic itself evidence that you deserve the complaint's dismissal. Machiavelli's analysis of this pattern appears in his discussion of the courtier who serves a prince whose approval is structurally unavailable. He wrote that a man who dedicates his life to earning the approval of someone who has decided not to give it has made that person's will the architecture of his entire existence. He has given them total power without receiving anything in return. The defense is a fixed internal standard that does not depend on external validation. You decide what adequate looks like. You decide when you have met it, and you notice when someone else's standard of what adequate looks like seems to move every time you approach it. Way 7. Identity replacement. The seventh and most comprehensive form of manipulation is the one that Machiavelli considered most dangerous precisely because it is the most complete. It does not target your behavior. It does not target your relationships. It targets your sense of who you are. And if it succeeds, it does not need to control any of the other dimensions of your life because you will control them yourself in the direction the manipulator has chosen. The pattern works through a gradual substitution of your self-concept. Your existing values, preferences, ways of engaging with the world, and sense of your own identity are characterized as the problem. They are the source of your difficulties. They are what is preventing you from being the person you could be. And the person you could be is a person whose values, preferences, and ways of engaging with the world are suspiciously well aligned with what the manipulator needs from you. This is not done through direct command. Direct command would be resistible. It is done through the sustained application of an alternative narrative about who you are. You are not someone who values their independence. You are someone who is afraid of intimacy. You are not someone who disagrees with this position because you have considered it and found it wanting. You are someone whose unresolved psychological issues are preventing you from seeing clearly. You are not someone with preferences that differ from the manipulator's preferences. You are someone whose preferences have been distorted by your history and need to be corrected. Over time, if this narrative is applied with sufficient consistency and backed by the full emotional weight of a significant relationship, it begins to replace your actual self-understanding. You start to interpret your own instincts through the framework the manipulator has provided. Your resistance becomes your dysfunction. Your preferences become your damage. Your identity becomes, in the most fundamental sense, a thing that belongs to someone else. Machiavelli's response to this threat is his most fundamental instruction across all his work. Know yourself, not as a philosophical exercise, as a strategic imperative. The man who knows his own values, his own reasoning, his own history, and his own actual motivations cannot be given a false version of himself that he accepts as true. The replacement requires a vacancy. Knowledge of self is what prevents the vacancy from forming. The defense begins with the most basic act of self-documentation. What do you actually believe? What do you actually value? What were your assessments of situations before the current narrative was applied to them? Write these things down. Not to share, not to argue from. Simply as an anchor. A record of who you actually were before someone decided to tell you who you actually are. 7 ways. Let me name them one final time. Manufactured obligation. Reframing your reality. Emotional flooding. Strategic victimhood. Isolation as architecture. The moving goalpost. Identity replacement. I want to address something directly before I close. None of these 7 patterns require malicious intent to function. Some of the people using them on you do not experience themselves as manipulators. They experience themselves as people in genuine need. As people who have legitimate expectations. As people who have been genuinely hurt, and some of them are right about those things. Their need is real. Their hurt is real. And the pattern is still operating. And the effect on you is still what it is. Machiavelli did not concern himself with the interior experience of the people exercising power. He concerned himself with the mechanics of how power operated. He argued that the question that matters is not whether the person doing this to you is a good person or a bad person. The question that matters is what they are doing, and what effect it is having on your capacity to live as a free agent in your own life. The 7 patterns I have described are all patterns in which that capacity is being eroded, in which someone else's will is being substituted for your own, through mechanisms specifically designed to make you experience that substitution as natural, as deserved, as something you are choosing freely. You are not choosing freely. But now you can. The first act of freedom is recognition. You have done that today. One of these 7 patterns is operating in your life right now. I am not asking you to name it in the comments if you are not ready to. But I am asking you to sit with it. To let the recognition settle. To resist the automatic impulse to explain it away on behalf of the person doing it. Machiavelli did not write The Prince as a manual for manipulators. He wrote it so that the people being managed could finally understand the game being played. That understanding, he argued, is the beginning of genuine freedom. If this video gave you something real today, the subscribe button is there. Not as a transaction. As a signal that you want to continue this kind of conversation. The kind that does not sugarcoat what is actually happening in the rooms where your life is being lived. Subscribe. And the next time you feel that something is off, trust that feeling. You are probably right.